Donna Mafia, Queen of Vengeance. Valeria Baldissera was born on an overcast morning that seemed to weep for her birth. The thick clouds hovered over the sprawling estate in the countryside outside Palermo, a portent of the turbulence that would define her life. Within those grand marble walls, an heir was expected, but her father, Don Angelo Baldissera, had already sired 2 sons who would carry on the family empire, or so he assumed. The arrival of a daughter barely registered, relegated to an afterthought in the presence of Marco and Luca, the strong, boisterous brothers destined, in her father's eyes, to rule. But from the earliest days it was clear that Valeria was unlike her brothers. Where they blustered through the manor's corridors, wrestling and smashing fine art, Valeria watched silently, soaking in the estate's secrets. She lingered in hallways, eavesdropping on whispered conversations between her father and his capos, absorbing details that swirled around illicit businesses, alliances, and clandestine deals. When curiosity overwhelmed her, Valeria crept into the library late at night, reading thick tomes on philosophy and war strategy. She did so with fervor, as though each line of text were a rung on the ladder that might elevate her above a destiny prescribed by archaic tradition. By age 8, Valeria displayed astonishing intelligence. She listened and learned, while her father believed her place was in the gardens, painting, or practicing feminine graces. She spoke little but assessed everything, dissecting every word from the men who commanded armies of soldiers. It was martial arts that caught her imagination next. She caught sight of the family guards practicing in a courtyard, their swift, brutal moves captivating her. Whenever their sessions ended, she mimicked their strikes and blocks in secret, perfecting each motion until it was fluid. Her father found out and was furious. A girl was to be shielded, not armed. Don Angelo commanded the guards to forbid Valeria from training. But she stole moments where she could, bribing or blackmailing a few sympathetic souls into teaching her the basics. In dusty storehouses and moonlit courtyards, she refined her craft. As her older brothers thrived on raw strength and familial privilege, Valeria sharpened herself into a lethal blade. When she turned 12, an incident forever changed her father's perception, even if he refused to acknowledge it openly. During a masquerade celebrating the anniversary of the Baldissera family's rule, one of the Don's lieutenants got into a drunken brawl with an invited rival. The conflict spilled onto the dance floor. Amid the screams and confusion, the rival produced a knife and slashed at the Don's lieutenant. 14-year-old Marco and 16-year-old Luca froze, panic gripping them like a vice, but Valeria didn't. She charged in, seized the attacker's wrist, and executed a flawless takedown. In seconds, the rival lay face down on the marble floor, howling in pain. Those who witnessed it swore they saw the ghost of a legendary warrior in her slim form. Yet Don Angelo, though begrudgingly impressed, reminded everyone that Valeria was a girl. A new hush fell over the estate whenever Valeria's name was spoken, a quiet, electrifying sense that she was far more than appearances suggested. By 17, she surpassed her brothers in martial skill and, more discreetly, in criminal acumen. In the darkness of the family's clandestine operations, she guided her brothers with subtle suggestions that they were often too prideful to admit came from her. She grew to resent the stifling environment. As a woman, she would never rise in the ranks, no matter her capabilities. Despite her father's love, he declared that leadership was men's business. A year later, Valeria faced a personal crossroads. Instead of enduring her father's dismissals, she chose to leave. It was not a gentle departure. A confrontation in Don Angelo's study ended with her father shouting that she had no place in his affairs and demanding she remain silent and subservient. She refused, and in a fit of temper, the Don banished her from his sight until she learned her place. Valeria left the Baldissera estate that very night, quietly, determined that if she could not prove her worth at home, she would forge a path far from the binds of tradition. She slipped away under the same overcast sky that had loomed on her birth, a meager bag slung over her shoulder. With her resources, from the small fortune she had quietly saved. Valeria set her eyes on Europe, a realm she had heard teemed with opportunity. She was determined to shape her own empire, one that would outshine even her father's. As she vanished into the horizon, the promise of her destiny carried her forward with relentless force. Valeria arrived in London with little more than her cunning and a single contact, an associate of her father's who operated a string of clubs under the radar. She found the city daunting and exciting, its sprawling streets a labyrinth of hidden corners, potential allies, and lurking threats. It was there she would sow the seeds of her empire. The associate introduced her to the local underworld's mid-level players, men and women hungry for opportunity but short on vision. Valeria took her time studying the power structures, who controlled the docks, who owned the clubs, who laundered money for whom. Her father had never allowed her into the family's financial dealings, but Valeria had paid close attention to every hushed conversation, and so she leveraged her deep understanding of clandestine operations, forging alliances with those overlooked by the bigger crime lords. She quickly discovered that London's criminal underbelly was ripe for the taking by someone with the intelligence to link disparate, often squabbling factions under one unified network. Valeria proposed bold collaborations, cooperative security for smuggling routes, shared intelligence networks, and a system of cross-border trade that minimized conflict while maximizing profit. Her approach worked. Disenfranchised street-level gangs saw the potential in aligning under a single banner. Mid-range smugglers, tired of being squeezed by the city's established families, gravitated toward her. She recruited from the ranks of the discarded and the ambitious, forging loyalty through fair dealings and mutual respect. Soon her reputation spread. Stories emerged of a brilliant, unflinching leader who was as adept at negotiation as she was at physically dispatching threats. Some brushed her off, calling these stories exaggerated rumors. No woman could be that effective in the underworld. But those who got close knew the truth. Over the course of several years, Valeria expanded beyond London, planting roots in Paris, Berlin, Barcelona, and Amsterdam. She built a shadowy empire, spanning gambling dens, underground boxing circuits, sophisticated smuggling routes, and high-end escort services that catered to the elite. Not once did she break her single moral code. No narcotics. That taboo had been instilled by her father, and though she defied him in nearly all else, she agreed that drugs brought reckless violence and brazen attention from authorities that could topple an empire. She honed her martial skills further, studying disciplines from around the world: Muay Thai, Krav Maga, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Her body became a lethal instrument, her mind a sharpened weapon. Those who tested her found themselves swiftly brought to heel. Rumors whispered of a confrontational meeting in a dockside warehouse with a Russian syndicate, during which Valeria single-handedly disarmed 3 men, killing one, before forcing their leader to sign a partnership deal. In the process, she became wealthy beyond her wildest dreams. She never basked in decadence the way other mob bosses did. No lavish parties or gaudy mansions. Instead, she maintained a modest, tastefully fortified estate in the outskirts of Amsterdam, where she devoted herself to perfecting both her strategic intellect and her lethal skill set. She summoned her top lieutenants from across Europe there, hosting monthly strategy sessions that resembled corporate board meetings rather than gangster summits. Despite her success, there was a disquiet in her soul. She had forged her empire to prove herself, yet a small voice in the back of her mind asked, prove herself to whom? Though her father rarely crossed her thoughts, her severed ties to Italy haunted her. She never truly admitted it, but a part of her yearned for recognition from the man who had cast her aside. Still, she pressed on. Respect was won through cunning and might, not given by paternal sentiment. She carved out her life's work with a relentless focus. Then, an unexpected summons arrived in the form of an encoded letter from an old family confidant, a short note stating that her father had requested her presence. No details, just an urgent plea to come home. Valeria hesitated. She was no longer the naive daughter desperate for approval. She was the uncontested head of a clandestine empire spanning multiple nations, Yet the old loyalty to her family and the fleeting sense of duty demanded she return. So, she boarded a private jet bound for Sicily, uncertain of what awaited her, determined only that she would show her father the woman she had become. The Baldissera estate, once a place of vivid color, felt muted under a heavy air of tension. When Valeria stepped through the doors, servants bowed in practiced deference, but they wore anxious expressions. She spotted her father immediately in a high-backed chair in the central foyer, hands trembling, face lined with worry. "Papa?" she said softly, inclining her head. It had been years since they had last spoken. Don Angelo stood, albeit with difficulty, and held out a shaking hand. "Valeria, my figlia, you came." He embraced her, albeit stiffly, and she noticed how much older he looked. Threads of white shot through his hair, and his once imposing stance had wilted. Marco and Luca were nowhere to be seen. The tension in the estate was palpable, as if everyone waited for an explosion that might come at any moment. Her father led her to his study, ignoring the curious eyes of staff. In that familiar room, the weight of memories pressed upon her. The last time they stood here, he had banished her. Now, sorrow tinted his voice. "I called you back because things are changing, Valeria. The other families are pushing into narcotics. I fear it will destroy the old ways." She could see regret in his eyes. Perhaps he finally understood the value she could have brought to him and the family business, but it was too late for apologies. She wasn't the docile daughter he had once tried to mold. They spoke for hours, dissecting the shifting power dynamics. A new wave of crime bosses, brash, greedy, and dangerous, had begun muscling in on Sicilian territory. Word was they intended to flood Sicily with drugs, an option Don Angelo vehemently opposed. He believed narcotics would bring the gaze of powerful law enforcement agencies and tarnish the delicate respect once upheld in the community. Valeria found herself agreeing. She despised the lure of narcotics, having seen firsthand the devastation it could wreak in cities across Europe. Still, her father resisted allowing her deeper involvement. He asked for advice, but would not permit her to lead. She saw the fear in his eyes, fear of losing the last vestige of the old tradition, fear of how other families would view his empire if a woman officially took the helm. She wanted to rail against him, but instead, she gave him strategic recommendations to fortify the estate, to protect her brothers, and to guard their financial assets. Only 2 days after her return, tragedy struck. In the dead of night, the estate reverberated with gunfire. Valeria jolted from her sleep, heart pounding. She grabbed the gun she always kept at her side and sprang into action. Shouts echoed in the dark corridors and windows shattered under a hail of bullets. She raced toward her father's suite only to find him slumped against a wall, blood staining his pajama shirt. Marco and Luca lay lifeless in the corridor, riddled with bullets. Rage and heartbreak warred within Valeria as she knelt beside her father, pressing trembling fingers to his neck. He was still alive, but just barely. "Papa!" she cried. "Hold on!" His eyes flickered open, brimming with pain. They've killed our family. They want the narcotics trade. Promise me." He never finished. The light died from his gaze, and Don Angelo Baldissera breathed his last. Valeria felt raw fury coursing through her veins, even as tears streaked her cheeks. A group of attackers, unaware of her presence, kicked down a nearby door. Valeria tucked herself against the wall and took them by surprise, firing precise shots. 2 men fell instantly, but a third fled. She pursued him through the estate, adrenaline blazing, her anger fueling every stride. Outside, she watched him vanish into the darkness, joining several other silhouettes that melted into the night. For a moment, she considered charging after them, but they were too many. She would be cut down by their gunfire before she took another step. She fell to her knees on the gravel driveway, trembling. Her father was dead. Her brothers were dead. This home, once so full of tension but still a place of memory, now bore the stains of betrayal. She was left with only a handful of loyal soldiers, some wounded, all terrified. In a single night, the Baldissera family was toppled, or so it seemed. But if her attackers believed Valeria Baldissera would fade away, they had made a grave miscalculation. Word of the Baldissera massacre spread like wildfire through the underworld. News was that Don Angelo and his 2 sons had been butchered, leaving no heir to lead. The new wave of crime bosses gloated at the swift elimination of one of Sicily's cornerstones, while the old guard mourned the loss of tradition. Whispers of who ordered the hit swirled, but no single name emerged. The only certainty was that certain families had conspired to dethrone the Baldisseras permanently. Then an invitation stunned the underworld. The Baldissera family requested all influential heads to attend a council at the old villa. Many suspected a trap or a plea for a negotiated surrender. Nevertheless, curiosity and the lure of advantage compelled them to arrive in droves. Among the arrivals was Antonio Cavallaro, a relatively new but highly respected figure from an ancient lineage of mafia leadership. He had made his name by balancing modernization with respect for tradition, something that set him apart from the brash newcomers. The villa's grand hall, once the site of glamorous galas and stately gatherings, was now shadowed by thick curtains and grim tension. Bodyguards stood in every corner. Conversation died as soon as an imposing figure strode to the head of the table. There stood Valeria. She wore a fitted black dress, elegant yet somber, her raven hair cascading over her shoulders. Her eyes were cold as winter, yet they blazed with contained fury. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Many had believed her dead or exiled. Others had dismissed her as inconsequential. But there she stood, bold as a queen reclaiming a stolen throne. "Welcome," Valeria began, her tone icily polite. "I thank you for responding to my invitation. Tonight, we end the speculation." Antonio Cavallaro watched her with keen interest. Stories had circulated about Don Angelo's daughter, the lethal intellect who had left years ago for Europe. She radiated an aura of command far beyond her slender frame. He'd come expecting many things, perhaps a shattered young woman seeking alliances. Instead, he saw a formidable leader about to unleash her wrath upon those who wronged her. Valeria clapped her hands and heavily armed men poured in, taking positions behind each family representative. A hush of panic swept the room. Nobody reached for a weapon. They knew it would be suicide. In the tense silence, Valeria nodded to an assistant who turned on a projector. Grainy images and documents splashed onto the large white wall. "These," Valeria said, her voice echoing in the stunned quiet, "are records detailing payments, phone calls, and meetings between certain families and the mercenaries who attacked the Baldissera estate. They brutally murdered my father and my brothers." Louder mutters filled the air as individuals recognized their own names on the documents. Some families reacted with angered shouts, others with stony silence. Valeria raised a hand, silencing them. "I will name no single head responsible. Many of you had a hand, whether large or small, in orchestrating this tragedy." Her eyes swept the room, pausing meaningfully at several known rivals. "The goal was to eliminate the Baldissera family, an obstacle to your plan of pushing narcotics throughout Sicily." She walked along the edge of the table, commanding every gaze. "The old ways forbid dealing in narcotics. My father held firm, and you slaughtered him for it." Her tone seethed with contempt. Antonio felt a pang of respect and sorrow. He despised the move toward drugs, understanding it was not just about money, but about inviting chaos and destroying the unspoken alliance with local communities. The mafia, in traditional lore, was paradoxically both protector and predator. The narcotics trade stripped away the notion of protector, leaving only the predator. Valeria returned to the head of the table, standing behind the seat that once belonged to Don Angelo. "Now I give you a choice. Pledge your loyalty to me, accept my leadership, or declare yourselves my enemy." A wave of anxious shuffling spread. More than one family head had come expecting to demand terms from a broken Baldissera. Instead, they faced a woman armed with damning evidence and a small army poised to fire at a single order. An older family lord sputtered in protest. "This is madness. You cannot—" A thunderous gunshot rang out. Valeria's bullet splintered the wooden table inches from his hand. The hush returned, deeper than before. "I can," she said simply. One by one, heads of families declared their stance. Most tried to appease her with vague compliance. But Valeria, with her thorough intelligence, recognized the insincerity. "Leave," she ordered them coldly, "and consider yourselves enemies of the Baldissera." A wave of shock and fear washed over the crowd. They realized Valeria was severing ties entirely. No compromise. Only one other smaller family pledged loyal support. Then Antonio Cavallaro stepped forward, his posture calm yet commanding. "I, Antonio Cavallaro, pledge my loyalty," he said, voice firm. "Not because I cower, but because I respect the traditions and cannot abide the new wave of narcotics. I stand with you, Valeria Baldissera." His declaration carried weight. The Cavallaro name was old and respected. The meeting concluded in a swirl of tension. Families that refused left under armed escort, vowing retribution. But Valeria Baldissera was prepared. She had spent years building alliances in Europe and commanded resources these short-sighted criminals could not imagine. As the hall emptied, Antonio lingered. Their eyes met, a moment thick with unspoken complexities. She saw no pity, only understanding. A spark of something else, too. An attraction neither could openly acknowledge yet. With a curt nod, she dismissed her guards. "Thank you," she said, her voice quieter now. He offered a faint smile. "Don't thank me. I did it for both our futures." Her mask wavered briefly, revealing the grief and anger swirling beneath the surface. "Then let's secure those futures, Cavallaro. Together." Days after the meeting, Sicily roiled with violence. The families who refused Valeria's ultimatum banded together, pooling their resources to quash this new threat. They had dismissed her as a figurehead, but now they recognized the ferocity she carried. They struck first, staging coordinated hits on Baldissera-aligned safe houses and shipping routes. Valeria, anticipating retaliation, had already evacuated crucial assets from those sites. Striking back, she unleashed a scorched earth campaign of her own, pulling in resources from her European empire. Teams of trained operatives swooped in, targeting the enemy's money laundering channels, seizing warehouses, and sabotaging shipments. A chain of explosive attacks rocked Palermo's outskirts, disabling the heavy armaments her rivals had stockpiled. Antonio Cavallaro played a pivotal role, offering both manpower and strategic acumen. While Valeria's operations hammered the rival families financially, Antonio's men launched precision strikes against smaller enclaves, forcibly dismantling their networks. The synergy between their forces was remarkable. Before anyone could mount a cohesive counteroffensive, half of the dissenting faction's infrastructure lay in ruins. In the middle of these battles, Valeria was a specter of vengeance. She emerged in black combat gear, leading raids with fearsome efficiency. She broke enemies with a combination of lethal martial prowess and strategic cunning. She personally interrogated captured lieutenants, extracting valuable intelligence on the alliances woven against her. On more than one occasion, she left a trail of battered bodies, each living witness serving to spread the legend of her cold, methodical wrath. Among the chaos, her budding alliance with Antonio Cavallaro turned into an unspoken dance. At first, they met only to discuss tactics in smoke-filled rooms cluttered with maps and radio equipment. Antonio proposed systematically cutting supply lines and bribing local authorities to look the other way. Valeria built on his ideas, adding her unique insight from European operations. Their synergy was undeniable. Their eyes often locked over the table, a silent resonance pulsing between them. The lines between professional collaboration and personal intrigue blurred further when, after a successful joint raid, they found themselves alone in a candle-lit side room of the Cavallaro estate. They were nursing bruises and scrapes, but a quiet exhilaration coursed through them. Valeria noticed a cut near Antonio's temple. "You're bleeding," she said, stepping closer to examine the gash. He shrugged, lips quirking. I've had worse. Her heart thudded. She saw his dark eyes flick down to her lips. For a charged moment, the air sizzled, but she pulled away abruptly, reining in the surge of attraction. She was not a woman who lost herself in the heat of battle, at least not yet. Their push against the rival families pressed on. Each skirmish felt more desperate, the enemy lashing out like a cornered animal. Death came swiftly to those who hesitated. While she grieved the loss of good soldiers, Valeria steeled herself, offering no mercy in return. One afternoon, her reconnaissance pointed to a key meeting of enemy leaders in a remote villa. She mustered a small strike team, and Antonio volunteered to join. In the hush before dawn, they infiltrated the premises. Shots rang out. Guards toppled. Valeria led the charge indoors, weaving through the narrow hallways. A door opened and a figure raised a rifle. Antonio lunged forward, yanking Valeria aside as bullets whizzed past. Together, they neutralized the threat with simultaneous gunfire. Adrenaline thundered in her veins. The raw intensity of facing death side by side with him stirred a mixture of gratitude and something more potent. They cornered 3 enemy capos in a lavish sitting room. Valeria demanded surrender, pressing her gun to the temple of one trembling man. Another tried to negotiate, offering money, alliances, anything. She scoffed. You murdered my family. I don't want your deals. She gestured to her team, who dragged the men away for interrogation. Outside, dawn began to break, painting the Sicilian sky in dusky pink and orange. Antonio let out a breath, shoulders easing. You saved my life back there, Valeria admitted. We saved each other's lives, he replied, wiping sweat from his brow. The quiet, shared look between them was more intimate than any conversation. For a fleeting moment, Valeria allowed herself the vulnerability of gratitude and an undeniable spark of longing. Then, they walked side by side back into the chaos, both aware that a deeper tension simmered beneath the surface of their alliance. As the days wore on, the war turned further in Valeria's favor. Family after family crumbled under her unrelenting onslaught. She left a few smaller players intact, warning them to avoid narcotics and pay tribute, or they would meet the same fate. Slowly, the once fractious underworld began to bend to Valeria Baldissera's will. The war, though devastating, was strategically nearing its end. Valeria established dominion over most of Sicily's underworld. The dissenting families either bent the knee or fled. Betrayals were met with swift retribution. In every whispering corridor, Valeria's name was spoken in hushed, reverent tones. The rightful heir of the Baldissera Empire had asserted her claim in blood and fire. Yet every triumphant strike brought her and Antonio closer. The synergy of their leadership ignited an unspoken closeness that smoldered beneath strategy sessions and battlefield chaos. Their eyes lingered on each other a fraction longer. Subtle touches, his hand on her shoulder, her arm brushing his, began to communicate more than words dared express. One night, after finalizing the logistics for a takeover of a crucial shipping dock, Valeria and Antonio found themselves alone in her father's old study. The room was now hers, the walls lined with books and the faint aroma of aged leather. A single lamp cast dancing shadows across the wooden desk. Valeria sat exhausted. Bruises marked her arms, souvenirs from the day's skirmishes. Antonio stood near the bookshelf, regarding her in the soft light. His jacket was draped across a chair, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar. She noticed a faint scar near his collarbone. You fight like a demon, he murmured, admiration lacing his tone. The men are terrified of you, you know. She managed a small, weary smile. Then they're smart. Fear keeps people alive. Often my own. Antonio stepped closer, resting a hand on the back of her chair. This can't be easy for you. I have no choice, she replied, voice quiet. My father's death, my brother's, I won't rest until I've avenged them fully. Her gaze dropped, and for a moment the mask of coldness cracked. The flicker of vulnerability tugged at Antonio's heart. He gently placed a hand under her chin, lifting her face to meet his eyes. "You're allowed to grieve, Valeria." She stiffened, unwilling to let pity slip into the space between them. But in the hush of the study, with the hum of cicadas outside, something in her resolved to let him see a fraction of her truth. Tears glimmered briefly, but she blinked them back. Without fully understanding why, she pressed her palm against his chest. His heartbeat was firm and steady under her touch. The air crackled with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. They were two leaders forged by blood and conflict, driven by ambition and vengeance. Yet in that moment, they were also just a man and a woman, bound by shared danger and a growing desire that refused to be contained. He leaned down and she rose to meet him. Their lips brushed tentatively, testing the spark between them. Her breath caught in her throat as the taste of him, salt and adrenaline, filled her senses. A rush of heat spilled through her veins, coiling tight in her stomach. The kiss deepened, months of tension erupting in one passionate moment. She clutched at his shirt, pulling him closer, feeling his strong arms wrap around her. The hunger was electric, fueled by all the life and death battles they had fought side by side. Neither had the luxury of softness in their world. Yet, in that moment, they found a frantic solace in each other. "Valeria," he breathed, voice thick. "Are you sure?" She silenced him with another kiss, raw and insistent. Words had always been inadequate for them. Action was their language of choice. Her fingers traced the muscles of his back, and she felt him shiver under her touch. They barely made it to the small settee near the window before the intensity of their desire overwhelmed them. Clothes were shed in hurried, urgent motions. Firelight from the lamp played across sweat-slicked skin as they became lost in the moment. She let go of every doubt, every barrier. In his arms she was both warrior and woman, possessed by the primal need to claim something that was purely hers. Time lost meaning as they explored each other in passionate desperation. Outside, the moon rose high, a silent witness to the collision of two souls who had found unlikely comfort in the darkest of worlds. When the frenzy finally eased, they lay entwined, breathing ragged. Antonio brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, his expression torn between awe and apprehension. "I never expected this," he admitted softly. Valeria placed a finger over his lips. "We don't live in a world of normal expectations. You and I, we're survivors. If this is real, then we'll face it, together." A faint smile curved his mouth. In that small moment, amid the swirl of her father's old study, Valeria allowed herself to believe in more than vengeance. She let herself imagine a future not solely drenched in blood. Nestling closer, she closed her eyes, savoring the quiet hush that enveloped them. If only for a moment. But the underworld never sleeps. At dawn, a messenger brought word that a final coalition of rival bosses had convened. They had retreated to a fortified compound inland, mustering what remained of their manpower. This would be their last stand, and it promised to be vicious. Valeria rose from Antonio's bed, her mind already racing with tactics. She slipped into her clothes, ignoring the dull ache of muscles well used. He dressed quickly beside her, and for a brief moment, they exchanged a look charged with emotion. There were no words needed. They had crossed a line that bound them in ways more potent than any vow. They assembled their forces at a remote farmland outside Palermo. The morning sun cast elongated shadows across a makeshift staging area where trucks and armored SUVs stood ready. Soldiers checked weapons and ammunition. Some looked at Valeria and Antonio with a sense of reverence that bordered on fear. They had witnessed these two decimate the competition time and again. An hour later, the Baldissera Cavallaro convoy arrived at the enemy compound, a sprawling estate with high walls and a steel-reinforced gate. Gunmen dotted the perimeter. Word had traveled fast. The compound was prepared for a siege. The tension hung thick in the air. Valeria surveyed the scene through binoculars from behind an armored SUV. She quickly identified structural weak points: a side entrance, a low section of wall. The plan was to cause a diversion at the main gate, while infiltration teams breached from the flank. She nodded to Antonio, who signaled for the assault to begin. The thunder of gunfire exploded. A forward squad advanced, returning fire with lethal precision. The gate shook under small explosives. Inside, the enemy scrambled to mount a counter-assault. With deft agility, Valeria led her infiltration team around the side. Under cover of the cacophony, they set shaped charges against the weaker wall section. The explosion tore a gaping hole, sending debris and dust flying. Without hesitation, Valeria and her soldiers charged in. The courtyard became a battleground. Bullets ricocheted off walls, peppering the air with shards of stone. Smoke curled through the sunlit space. Chaos reigned as men shouted. Blood stained the tiled paths, and the stench of cordite filled every breath. Valeria caught sight of a commanding figure at the far end, the main orchestrator of the rival coalition. She recognized him from the documents she had revealed at her fateful meeting. He looked panicked, flanked by bodyguards. Rage surged within her. Her father's murder, her brother's bullet-ridden bodies, the humiliations she'd endured, everything crystallized into a single purpose. She pressed forward, weaving through gunfights. A bodyguard lunged at her with a knife. In a flash, she deflected the strike, twisted his arm, and sent him crashing to the ground. Another raised a gun, only for Antonio's shot to drop him mid-aim. They converged on their target, who backed away with terrified eyes. Wait, we can talk," he stammered. Valeria's response was a single gunshot to his thigh. He collapsed with a howl. She kicked his weapon away, her eyes brimming with icy fury. "Talk?" she repeated, voice low. "Did you talk before you slaughtered my father? My brothers?" He groaned, clutching his bleeding leg. "It was only business. She silenced him with another bullet, this time to the shoulder. Blood spread across his fine suit. "You dishonor the old ways, dealing in narcotics, thinking you can seize power through mass murder. That ends today." Terror warred with defiance in his eyes. He spat at her boots. "You're just a woman, Baldissera. You won't hold Sicily without us. You'll be devoured." She squeezed the trigger, and the bullet tore into his chest. The man jerked, life draining from his eyes, and collapsed into a spreading crimson puddle. Silence descended, broken only by distant gunfire as the last pockets of resistance were mopped up. Valeria gazed down at the corpse, the final orchestrator of the coup that had killed her family. Antonio stepped beside her, breath coming hard. Their eyes met. They understood the significance of this moment, a closure of sorts, an exorcism of old ghosts. She lowered her gun, exhaling. The rest of the skirmish concluded swiftly. Enemy fighters either surrendered or died. By midday, the compound was under Valeria's full control. Another stronghold of the new wave of narcotics traffickers had fallen, effectively decapitating what remained of the rebellion against her leadership. In the following weeks, Valeria consolidated her power. Families that had once scoffed at her name bent the knee, forming uneasy truces. She purged Sicily's underworld of the narcotics trade as thoroughly as she could, reasserting the old codes. Some whispered that her methods were too brutal, but none dared challenge her. She took the seat of power as the new Donna of the Baldissera Empire. Antonio stood at her side. Their relationship, kindled in the fires of war, had become a guarded partnership. They alternated nights at each other's estates. Though they tried to keep their bond discreet, rumors spread. Some worried a romance would make them vulnerable, but others saw it as a potent alliance that merged two powerful lineages. One evening, on the terrace of the restored Baldissera villa, Valeria stared across the moonlit fields, thinking of her father. She wondered if he would have been proud or horrified by the lengths she'd gone. Antonio approached, slipping an arm around her waist. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked gently. "I wonder if any of this will last," she replied softly, turning to him. "Peace is fragile in our world." He nodded, gaze steady. We've made enemies and more will come. But together we stand a better chance. You and I. We've defied expectations." She smiled faintly, the hard lines of her face softening for once. "Indeed we have." In that moment, she allowed herself a momentary hope. She had attained vengeance, reclaimed her family's legacy, and found an unexpected partner who matched her ambition and ferocity. The road ahead would be perilous, but she was no longer alone. They kissed under the silver glow of the moon, the hush of the night enveloping them. In the silent fields and the ancestral halls, ghosts might still linger. But Valeria's reign had begun. She was the daughter once ignored, the lethal mind overshadowed by men. Yet she emerged the conqueror of an underworld steeped in treachery and blood. Henceforth, Sicily and the rest of the Mafia world would utter her name with a mixture of fear and awe. Valeria Baldissera, the woman who seized power in a man's domain, shaped her destiny, and forged a love as fierce as the storms of vengeance that had catapulted her to the throne.